Hello everyone and welcome to the webinar Applying Transportation Asset Management to Traffic Signal Assets. My name is Nilu Parvinashtiani and I'll be helping with facilitating today's webinar. This webinar is sponsored by the Federal Highway Administration and hosted by the National Operations Center of Excellence, also known as NOCO. I wanted to cover a few logistics before we kick off the webinar. We are recording this webinar, and that recording along with the PDF of the presentation will be published on the NOCO website. All attendee forms are on listen-only mode by default, but please stay engaged by using the question discussion pod for any comments or questions that come to your mind during the presentation. We have dedicated time at the end for a Q&A session. So please just put those questions in the chat as they come to your mind, and we'll make sure to cover them at the end of the webinar. So that is all I had, and with that, I'll hand it over to Joe Gregory to start us off. Joe?
Great. Thank you, Neil. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. First of all, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the effort that we've been going through the past couple of years to get to where we're at. Real quick introduction, I'm Joe Gregory. I'm with the Federal Highway Administration, Office of Operations. So a lot of my activities involve TSMO, but also the intersection between TSMO and asset management. And then we have our contracting team consisting of Erin, Flanigan, and Gareth Mckay, who will be helping us today with this presentation. But just give you an overview real quickly of today's session. I'm going to go quickly over the purpose of this project and what we were hoping to accomplish, and also get into applying asset management to traffic signals at a conceptual level. Gareth is going to go more into detail in terms of what to expect in this report, and then also some themes that came out during our research on traffic signals asset management, and then just go over quickly what to expect in the final primer. So just to start things off, over the past few years there's been a convergence, so to speak, between the TSMO world and the asset management world. If you picture maybe a couple circles in a Venn diagram, you're starting to see the overlap in between start to become greater and greater, where you have TSMO personnel who have historically focused primarily on deploying technology, deploying signals, deploying ITS, the technology assets, where questions like how do we maintain them have been typically an afterthought. They're starting to have those conversations more and more in recent years. And then you have the asset management community that have primarily focused on pavements and bridges, but they're starting to get into other assets as well. So this presents a great opportunity in terms of, okay, where can we apply asset management principles to our traffic signal assets? So that was the motivation behind developing this material. And let me work on my slides here. So with traffic signals asset management, I mean, it recognizes that TSMO practices are going to continue to evolve, and recognizing that signal assets are going to be critical to the performance of the system in terms of safety and mobility, but it also can be a very significant investment if you start adding up not just the cost of installation, but the cost of maintaining and operating throughout its life cycle as well, and even the cost of replacing it toward the end of its life. And there's also accounting for the evolution, so to speak, of asset management going all the way back to the late 80s and even early 90s with IST, where we started applying to the pavements world and the bridge world. And now, like I said earlier, we're starting to apply it to other assets. So the framework behind the material that we're finishing up developing is the TAMP requirements, the requirements for state DOTs to develop transportation asset management plans. And you see here the bullet list of the sections that are needed to be in these TAMPs. So the idea here is that this would be a resource to state DOTs who may want to incorporate their signal assets into their TAMPs for the upcoming iteration, but also if they decide not to include signals into their TAMPs, it can be a resource to continue asset management activities in this area outside of the TAMP as well if they choose. And then also recognizing that a lot of traffic signals are owned and operated by local agencies who are not required to produce TAMPs, but this can be a resource for them as well. So here, it also gets into a discussion on where do you see the connection points between asset management and performance management. Here, this figure here comes from the AASHTO Asset Management Guide that came out a couple of years ago. You can find that online, but it gets into where those interrelationships may be. With that, I'm going to turn over to Gareth to go over the details of these themes that get into it. But just to start off real quickly, as part of this project, we did a literature search. We conducted listening sessions to state and local DOTs. And when you have enough of these conversations, some common themes start to emerge. And you see these 5 themes here. These are the themes that are, that have come up quite a bit. So we really wanted to hone in on that and apply those themes to the asset management, to the TAMP requirements, but just overall to advancing asset management in the signal world. So with that, I will turn it over to Gareth. So thank you.
Thanks, Joe. And I'm just going to just touch a little bit more on these themes. And as Joe mentioned, they've been pulled together from discussions with a lot of agencies through listening sessions we held a couple of years ago now. And these 5 themes, I'm going to run through them relatively quickly, probably over the next 30 to 40 minutes. But you'll be able to read a lot more about these as you go through and look at the primers once they become available. The ideas, concepts, areas of improvement and those sort of things that people were looking for, as Joe mentioned, we grouped into these 5 themes. The first one is talking about asset. What do we know about our assets? Where are they? How many of them do we have? What condition are they in? And making sure we understand what traffic signal assets we're looking to manage. The second one is once you start to collect some information about those assets, how do you store that information? How do you analyze it? How do you report it? How do you use it? So we'll talk about that a little bit further. Joe touched on that link between asset management and performance management. Performance measures and targets are very important to drive an asset management outcome. So understanding what you're currently achieving and what you might want to achieve in the future. And then in terms of maximizing that performance, lifecycle planning is the process to do that. So understanding what it costs to manage and operate and replace and upgrade those assets over their life. So once we've been through that process and understood that, we're then in a better position to communicate resource needs, what's going to be achieved with the resources we have, with more or less resources, what the outcome for that might be. So once going through and understanding all of these 5 steps, it'll then, you'll see on this next slide, we've focused on those 5 themes because as Joe mentioned, this is something that can be applied for any agency at any stage in terms of developing your asset management practice. If an agency goes through and addresses these 5 themes, they'd be well placed to address all of these TAMP elements that Joe introduced earlier on. You'll see some of them appear multiple times, but the 5 themes that we've got here definitely address all those elements and put agencies in a good position moving forward. So let's jump into the first one, which is asset identification. The first part of asset identification is understanding what you want to collect, defining those there, what is an asset, and going through that process, understanding to what level of detail, so we'll talk about attributes and components and hierarchy, and then we'll talk about how we manage that inventory and ensure that the information that is stored is accurate and reliable, so that when someone goes in there, they can get what they want, they can get it easily, and they know that it is correct, and they trust the information that they're pulling out. The definition that we've got on the screen here is the Federal Highway definition for an asset as a basis for asset management. We had lots of discussion on this as we went through this PRIMA development process. You will see here that the definition talks about physical infrastructure within the right-of-way. There was a lot of discussion from a traffic signal perspective that there is a lot of assets that will not sit within the right-of-way, whether that be signal timing plans, processes, connections back to traffic operations center, the people and the processes and the systems that sit within a traffic operations center. There's a lot of different stuff here that needs to be considered, and people are grappling with that and are trying to address that. But from this perspective and the focus here, the starting point is we're looking at those assets within the right-of-way corridor that sit within this asset definition. Level of detail. You'll see two options here on the slide in front of you. To start off with, signal asset. An asset will have a number of different pieces that make it up, but knowing how many of these signal assets we have, where they are, is the first starting point. Often we found that with a lot of agencies, once they started to understand how many assets they had, they wanted to get into more detail, understand things further. So for the next few slides, I'll talk about those as signal components or pieces of those signal assets. And you'll see some examples on the slide in front of you. Oregon DOT was one of the agencies that we talked to in terms of how they are dealing with this. They capture, as well as their signal assets, they capture components of those assets, or subgroups as they call them. They make sure they're all connected and there's a hierarchy there, so that when components and pieces are identified and recorded in their system, they are attached up to what's sometimes called a parent asset, so the overall signal that they're located at, so everything is connected together. To me, one of the most important parts on this slide is the third bullet point. So one thing that is important to Oregon DOT is that they are continually reviewing the component level data that they are tracking and collecting, and make sure that that information that they are recording is informing decisions that they make about those traffic signal assets. So they recognize that there's a lot of time and effort that goes into collecting that information, and they're continuously thinking about how that informs the decisions they make. And you'll hear me go on and on about that today, about informing decisions. To me, that's just the key part of asset management, is having that information and data, and how are we using it to do what we have to do every day. Utah DOT is another example here. We've got some thoughts from Utah DOT. Utah DOT has a tiered approach to their assets, and traffic signals and ITS is up there in terms of the top tier alongside pavements and bridges. And what those tiers mean for Utah DOT is that those assets, they want to have the most information about them. There's requirements in terms of what information is collected about those assets. They need to be able to analyze and communicate what's happening to those assets, what's changing with them over time, predict what's happening over time, what investments are made, when and why that is. And along with those, being able to communicate and have that information available, along with it comes dedicated funding for those assets. So obviously Utah DOT are recognizing the critical nature of traffic signals as part of their mobility network. So from Utah DOT, there are some of the critical factors they identified for asset identification. Limit the amount of information you're collecting. Take baby steps in terms of collecting that information. Work out what you want and what you're going to use it for. Make sure that there is a connection there to your work order management. So going out and initially collecting data, as soon as someone goes out there, opens a cabinet, does something to that traffic signal, things change. And so it's important to have a connection there to that process, otherwise the information quickly becomes out of date, and people lose confidence in it. Ensure that staff understand the purpose of data collection. You're collecting these things, why are we doing it? There's always requirements for teams out there in the field to perhaps do some interpretation in terms of how they are recording information about assets. Having an understanding of what it's being used for will help with that. And for Utah DOT, it was important for them that they had mobile hardware they were using for collecting and updating this asset information. That ensured that the process was efficient as possible for those that were asked to do it, and also it meant that there was significant accuracy in terms of what they were doing. So as a summary for asset identification, clearly define the asset attributes that you're going to collect, and add and build on that incrementally over time. Start simple. As you have a need or a desire for more information, look how you can add to that and build on it, and further develop the information that you have. So identify the most critical components that you want to collect information on, and make sure that when you do go out there and start collecting, there's a clear link between components and overall assets in terms of how the bits and pieces connect together, so everything can be easily located and reported out. Once people start to go and collect information, the next step is they want to have a management system that they can use to manage that and use the data that they have available. So some critical aspects of that. The first thing is to understand the system functionality that you require. So we'll talk through a list of that functionality that may be desired, and talk about that. It's important to understand how you're going to collect location-specific information and store that information. How does that connect and relate to other information that an agency collects and stores? System interfaces and integration. You're never going to have one system that does it all. You will always look to have interfaces, whether that's with financial systems or other management systems. So you've got to understand those connections. And it's important to think about implementation of a system and making sure that it's successfully adopted by all those that need to use it or will want to use it, and you need to start thinking about that at an early stage in the process. From a system functionality perspective, we've got 2 slides here that talk about all the things you may want from a system functionality perspective for traffic signal assets. The first 2 we've talked about there have asset identification, asset condition. We've touched on those with the previous theme. Work planning and management. You want to understand and track the work that's done on those assets. So that's something you'll want to understand. You may want to look at materials management, the parts that are used, and have a process or a system in place to understand that. For technology assets, warranties, and the application of those warranties is an important part of what we need to do. So how is that being tracked, and how is that being understood for all those through the maintenance and operations process that have to look after those assets. Once you have all that information, looking at planning, budgeting, and doing modeling and analytics to be able to take that information and look what that means into the future, and we'll talk about that as we go on through these themes. And finally, how you report some of that information out. So over these 2 slides, there's a broad range of high-level functionality that you may want as an agency in terms of managing these assets. And it may be that some of these things are done by existing systems, some of them you may want new systems. But the first bit is understanding what decisions you want to make, how are you going to use the information, and then testing that against what you already have. Minnesota DOT was an agency that had been through the process of implementing an asset management system and were happy with the outcomes that they achieved through that process. So when we talked to them, there was 5 bullet points here that they identified as being some of the key reasons they thought their process was successful. The first one was that the person that was setting up their system didn't walk off the site as soon as they went live with it. They had access to them after that process so that they could fix anything that came up, and so that was something that they thought was very critical to them. They recognized that in order to drive the success of this implementation, they needed to have internal resources that were committed to doing so. So they recognized that and they had those dedicated resources in place. So I know one of the things that they had to do there is they wanted to ensure that once they started collecting information, that the information was correct and up to date. So they were continuously doing QA checks on the information that was being provided, and using that to train and educate those that were collecting information if there were any errors or opportunities that were seen, to make sure that the information they were getting was as good as possible. So focusing on identifying where there were opportunities, retraining and helping those that were collecting that information to make sure it was effective and up to date. They involved stakeholders all the way through the process, from identifying technical, business and system requirements all the way through to having champions once things went live that knew everything that was going on across all departments, were able to help those that needed help. They recognized that having those interfaces between the system they were putting in place and other systems that the agency had was important to make sure that people could consistently pull the information they needed. And so they made sure those were set up at day one when things went live, and really focused on the reporting and monitoring and making sure that the information that people were able to pull from their system was user-friendly and was going to help them with the decisions they needed to make. So from a system perspective, when we are looking for systems to help with an asset management process, the most important thing, most important starting point is to identify system requirements, business and functional requirements that you want any systems to help you with. Look at what you already have, understand where there might be gaps that you might need to fill if necessary. Maybe you just need to work on the interfaces between existing systems, maybe you need new systems. But first of all, identify and develop a list of business and functional requirements that are going to be important for you in terms of managing your traffic signal assets. As you go through the process, and right from the start, you'll see stakeholders are identified right in the first bullet point on this slide. Have that stakeholder engagement plan. Get people involved from across the agency all the way through the process. Start with a pilot to make sure you work out all the bugs before you go live, and then as you after you have implemented, collect feedback. And recognize that there are both frequent and infrequent users. So there's those that use the system every day and will have different needs to those that need to access it once a month, once a year, and make sure that for all these different parties you think about how they're doing that, how they get the information they need, and how they know where they can go and get help when it's necessary. With any type of asset management, performance measures are an important part of it. And I think with traffic signals is really an area where this all comes together. If you look at any agency that's out there and look at the vision or strategic direction that they want to head, they're bringing together hopefully asset management, but they're definitely looking at mobility and safety. And for all three of those things, I think traffic signals is sort of at the crux of that, and it has a part to play in all those sort of goals that any agency wants to achieve. So performance of these important assets is really critical. And there's some different terms that have been used here. It does change as for different agencies in different places. But asset availability is the key thing. So the time that traffic signal asset is available, operating, functioning as we want it to function. So at the end of the day, that's the overall outcome we want to achieve. And there's two pieces that to that puzzle that we've sort of listed here. The first is asset reliability and condition, and that is a measure of whether the asset is able to function as intended without failure. And so it's often mentioned by the amount of time that it's up and running. And the other bit here is more about the resilience of that asset or the processes that you have in place to when something goes wrong, be able to bounce back and get that asset or those signals back up and running. So that's that second bullet point there does contribute to the first in terms of what you're overall achieving, but it is something different to measure and manage. This is an example from the Connecticut DOT 2019 TAMP. So they're reporting here on state-owned traffic signals. And you can see here they've used a proxy for condition based on the age of those assets. So for good, fair, poor, they've got different ages that they're using to indicate whether the condition of those assets. This is a snapshot of where Connecticut was at in 2019. When we talked to them at that time, they were wanting to move ahead and move beyond just start looking at a component-based approach and considering both age and condition as indicators of what they were achieving with their traffic signals. The next two slides are an example from Highways England. And they have asset maintainability and availability metrics that they use. They have different expectations for different what they call performance categories. And what they've done here is they've taken the different assets or components that they have and put them in different performance categories and set different expectations on those. This table here is an explanation of those different the expectations for those different performance categories. You'll see that in category 1, the expectation is that 100% of faults are restored or remedied within 24 hours. For performance category 2 assets, you've got 48 hours to restore all the faults. For category 3, 90% of those are restored within 168 hours, but for 100%, you've actually got quite a long time there until those need to be completely resolved. So those are response times that they're measuring, and at the bottom there, you can see that there's an impact there in terms of the availability of those assets. So when you've got the higher response times, the expectation is you're going to have those assets available more often. And in terms of assigning assets to these different categories, they go through a process of looking at the criticality of those assets and the importance of them and to the overall mobility of their system. And safety outcomes they want to try and achieve, and then have different expectations to that. Utah DOT. Coming back to their example here, this is them reporting on condition of their traffic signal assets over time. And this goes from 2014 through to 2019. You can see in here they've got a target red line that's been set. And there's actually a slight error on the slide. It should be target is 95% average or better. So you can see here that from 2014 through to 2018, there was more than 5% poor traffic signals, but come 2019, they've been able to correct that and reduce that percent poor down to a very small number. So they've been tracking this over a period of time, looking at this performance measure, and that's enabling them to now set a target and manage towards that target. So a quick review on performance measures and target setting. It's important to think about what performance measures and targets are important to you, which ones you can manage to, and make sure you define those early in your process and set achievable targets. In terms of developing a framework and a process, you'll need to think about what data would be needed to be collected and tracked to be actually report against those performance measures. So there needs to be the ability to do that, and we need to understand those implications. You then go through a process of start tracking and collecting that information to support your decision making. We'll talk about that a little bit more in terms of life cycle planning, one of the themes coming up. And then make sure in terms of, once you've had those that performance framework in place, seek feedback on how that information is being used, whether people are able to manage to those measures and targets, and whether any change needs to be made. So from an asset management perspective, with all these items, we're talking about continuous improvement as we work through a process and learn more about what's going on. The next step is maximizing that performance. So we're understanding, we know about the assets that we have, we start thinking about the performance that we're achieving. And now we want to look at life cycle planning. So life cycle planning is estimating, understanding the cost of managing an asset over its whole life and looking at ways we can minimize that cost. The second bullet point here talks about maintenance management, and within the primer there's a lot of discussion about these different maintenance management approaches. There's three examples given here. The first one is condition-based, so understanding the condition of your assets and making a decision about when to go in and do something to those assets based on that condition knowledge. The second one is interval-based, so you may not understand the condition, but you know that every 5 years you're going to go in and do this, or you're going to replace these every 7 years. So not collecting that condition information, but having a plan to do something on a regular interval basis. The third one there is being reactive and responsive. So when something goes wrong, understanding what that is, going in and making a repair, rehabilitation, or a fix at that time. To me, it's important to understand that all these approaches are valid. Not everything needs to be condition-based. It's not cost-effective to have everything condition-based. And the first step is understanding that you have these different approaches that you employ, making sure it's clear which ones you are using and when you're using them and for what assets. And learning from that and understanding where your risks are and where you might want to change your approach. So we'll talk about some examples of that as we go through this section. The third bullet there talks about work types, and these are the ways of defining the different activities you're undertaking. From an FHWA perspective, within asset management plans, they talk about the work type categories that are listed there. and they're used as a guide, and they are, it's really up to any agency to define these work types in a way that makes sense to them, the way that they can report on, and a way that helps them communicate their decision making. A couple of slides here on an example from Australia by Austroads. There's a couple of useful Austroads manuals that looks at how they operate and manage their traffic signals and ITS assets. There's a range here of different methods that are considered and used in terms of predicting performance of traffic signals. So a lot of people here use manufacturers' performance data. Obviously those that, the second bullet point is about those that use and manage these assets day in, day out, and their experience and knowledge of them. Look, the third one is looking over your shoulder and seeing what others are doing and what can we get from others. Documenting your agency's experience, so having maintenance records within a database is another way of predicting performance. And once you have all those bits and pieces, looking at how you can do some analyses to compare performance and cost of alternative approaches, and using models and information systems to assist with that. So a range of different things that can be used there to predict performance. And something that these Austroads guides do is they take, they talk about a range, and there's many pages on all the different assets that they have. This example is for electronic communications infrastructure. They look at the asset, they look at the possible failure modes from a life cycle perspective. They then look at how they're going to predict the service or life of those assets and the information that's required for monitoring and understanding that. So they're taking that first step in terms of recording, this is what we do and this is why. The technology assets and traffic signals, this is very much the case. Obsolescence is a real challenge that agencies have to deal with. So a traffic signal asset or component can become obsolete even if it is still in good physical condition and functioning. So in these instances, for example, if we're using manufacturer's life for these assets, it may be that we're in a situation where an asset needs to be replaced while it's well short of that expected life. And sometimes there's good reason for that. Sometimes it's due to support that you're getting. And the other reason is because there may be a benefit in terms of upgrading things, because there is a net benefit to mobility and reliability. So even though things are operating well, there's significant benefits in terms of upgrading a component or elements of a traffic signal. It's hard to predict those points when that's going to occur. So it's something that needs to be continually considered, and it can shorten the expected life of an asset and mean that it needs to be replaced sooner than what you originally expected. Again, within the primer, there's a lot of discussion about obsolescence and how that influences the asset life cycle. There's discussion about a process called reliability-centered maintenance. And those middle three bullet points sort of talk through that. And that goes into discussing, looking at the components of your traffic signals and understanding which components are the highest risk, identifying that risk, and then considering mitigation strategies. So what are the strategies you can put in place or could put in place? With all risks, there will be times when you want to just accept that risk and manage it when something happens. In other situations, that won't be an acceptable approach, and you'll want to do something about it or be prepared for the time when that be better prepared or get ahead of that before that obsolescence or that risk becomes real. I have an example here from Minnesota DOT, and so as part of their TAMP process, their last TAMP in 2019, they went through some analysis to look at different life cycle planning strategies for their traffic signals. Strategies A to D listed here looked at a number of different approaches. Strategy A was just being reactive, having that reactive approach and repairing things when necessary. Strategy B did some inspections and preventive maintenance and looking at what impact that would have on the overall costs. Strategy C looked at an interval-based approach to some of the electronics and LED and proactively replacing those on a periodic basis. And strategy D looked at doing structural inspections and delaying when major rehab or total rebuilds of signal systems was necessary. There was a range of analysis done to look at these different items, and you can see strategy A was the reactive approach, and that was the sort of base approach that was looked at. On the bottom line here, you can see that the equivalent annual cost of that was about $8,900 per year per signal. And they then looked at what was the incremental cost for some of these other strategies. So strategy B, when there was preventive maintenance done, you can see there that it does actually cost more. So it's $23 per year additional per signal. But from a Minnesota DOT perspective, they considered that those efforts were beneficial for operational and liability reasons. So although that strategy cost more, there are additional benefits that were gained from it. So it was something that was worthwhile considering. In strategy D, you can see there that there is it's a subtraction, so there's actually reduced costs looking at strategy D, and so that going out there and doing structural inspections and doing maintenance where required did have some benefit by lengthening the time between total rebuilds of the system. So from a lifecycle planning perspective, there's a number of key actions that can be considered. The first is understanding those approaches, the ones that you're currently doing and the ones that might be available to you. You know, what do you have the staff to do, or could you get the staff to do? Consider the life cycle cost of those different approaches, similar to that work that was done, we just talked about there by Minnesota DOT. And then utilize those, consider the risk of obsolescence and how that might influence that decision making. Utilize your findings to inform decisions, and that's what we're going to go into next in terms of resources. Once you do make a decision on an approach, make sure you put it into practice and communicate what the expectations are to those that need to be considering and looking at that day in, day out. So moving on to resource allocation. There's two overarching pieces to this. One is having the information to inform resource allocations. So that could be the cost to deliver different life cycle planning strategies or the cost to achieve a desired outcome. And the second approach is capping, I guess, from a resourcing perspective, capping those resources and saying what can be achieved with those resources that you have available. Once you've done that analysis and you're able to better communicate that, it's important to talk to stakeholders or those that are responsible for assigning resources. Make sure they're aware of what the impacts of their decisions might be, and be able to clearly communicate that to them. And also, and then once resources are assigned or set, it is important for those that are responsible for delivering the outcomes to understand those targets and how that may change the approach they have in terms of managing those assets. If we don't clearly communicate that, then people will just keep doing what they've always been doing, and the outcomes may or may not change. This example from Connecticut DOT is specifically for traffic signals, and it looks at some different funding scenarios. So you can see they have what's termed a state of good repair goal. So the percent of they want looking at 80% of traffic signals in a state of good repair. They're looking at what can be achieved with the solid blue line with their current funding, and with the dash blue line, what their preferred funding is to get to that state of good repair goal, and then an alternative with no funding, what the outcome would be. This analysis, it can be complex or it can be very simple. So if you look at what Connecticut DOT have done then with this last bullet point, we saw earlier on that they're measuring their good, fair, poor based on age. They're looking at how those signals over time will fall from good to fair to poor, and looking at the number of signals that they're replacing each year. When they have additional investment to replace more signals, they're able to lift more from good or fair, from poor or fair up to good, and so they're able to change that trend in terms of what's happening into the future. Asset valuation is an approach. In my mind, it's a powerful approach and something that we could look to use a little bit more. It's not easy for stakeholders, decision makers, those that assign budgets, to understand what the impact of good, fair or poor traffic signals is. Everybody understands what a dollar is. So if we can talk about things in dollar values, it can be powerful for us in terms of showing what's going on with our assets. There's a number of ways to look at and calculate asset valuation. There's two here that's listed: replacement value and condition-based value. There's a lot of different research and relatively recent research out here on asset valuation and ways to do that. So there's some good resources out there. But if we, at the end of the day, if we can communicate the value of an asset, what value that has to, and how that value changes over time. What are we doing to maintain that value? Are we doing enough to maintain that value? Ultimately, we're able to communicate, what are we leaving for those that come after us? Are we just taking all the value out of this and leaving them with a problem? It's easily communicatable if we look at using asset value to do that, and understand how that's going to change and what that's going to leave for others. There's an example on here from Colorado DOT. They did a lot of analysis across a broad range of assets in 2016, and they're currently going through the process of updating that as part of their 2022 TAMP. So they'll be in a position to say, well, look, this is how things have changed over time. This example from CalTrans is a good example for them, and it's a way that they're using their TAMP to communicate outcomes. So this is for traffic signals and ITS assets combined. It's looking at current performance, and so their goal here is 90% good assets. They're currently at about 59%, so have a 31% gap. But what they're communicating here is that their 10-year expected outcomes, they're going to go from 59% good to about 90% and achieve their goal. And so have no performance gap. So that's a great news story for CalTrans. But with every good news story, there is, this is where we're going to be in 10 years. Well, now we have to make sure we achieve it. So this is where it becomes important to have those strategies in place and make sure you actually deliver on it. So obviously there's been a number of these scenarios or bills here passed to give funding to address this, and now the onus is on making that happen. So clearly communicating how that's going to be achieved, what has to be done on an annual basis to get there over that 10-year time frame. So from a resource allocation perspective, the first thing to do is develop up a process or analysis to inform investment strategies, to look at different life cycle planning approaches and understand the outcomes from those, and from different investment levels, what are the performance outcomes that can be achieved. Consider the use of asset valuation as an approach to identify how, again, and better communicate, I guess, is the key thing, how asset value is going to change over time, and be able to share that and clearly communicate what the impact of investment decisions might be. When you come up with those investment strategies, identify who needs to be aware of them, both decision makers and those, again, responsible for delivery. And one of the things that came up was the utilization of traffic signals management plans as an opportunity to share those strategies. This is how we do things in our agency, and using that as a good method to record that and share that with others. So that's the summary of the themes. The themes that are described in the primer. The final primer is not quite yet available. Erin and Joe are working really hard to get that primer ready to go. I'm expecting it'll be ready very soon, and it'll be available. And Joe, I'm sure that you will let people know where they can access that, and write out to people when that is going to be available.
Yeah, thanks, Gareth. As he said, we're putting the final touches, trying to do the final formatting for this primer to get ready to be posted on our website. So we're hoping that will be online within the next couple of weeks. So what I'll do is I will post a link in the chat box. This is our Asset Management for Operations website, and that's where we'll post the primer. So just check back in the next week or two, and like I said, we anticipate it'll be online then. As Gareth mentioned, this presentation is pretty much a summary of what to expect in the primer. So the primer is going to go more into detail on the themes and the examples from agencies that we went over today. So, but we just want to give you a taste of what to expect. Also, for those who may be interested as well, there were similar peer exchanges or recordings that have been done over the past year. I'll put one is from the Center of Excellence, which I'll put in the chat box now, and then the other is from the AASHTO Asset Management Committee that recently, as part of the webinar series, did one on connecting TSMO and asset management. So if that's something that interests you, I put links there in the chat box that you can take a look at when you have time. So with that, we can open the floor for any questions. And I see one in the chat box right now, Tracy Scriba. Are there one or two areas that you found to be the biggest challenges for agencies? So Gareth, I don't know if you want to take take a swing at that, and then maybe I can follow up.
Sure, no problem, Joe. You know, I guess when I see that question, the first thing that came to mind for me is an example of discussions with one agency where they started to invest a lot of time and effort on collecting information. They sent people out there to collect information about their assets, what they had and where it was. But one of the things that they didn't do, or they were having a real challenge to do, was to get others separate from that group that were responsible for the maintenance and maintenance of those assets to be updating that information they had. So for that agency, that was a huge challenge for them, and what it meant is they had to go around and collect the information again for all those they knew that people had been out there and touched and worked on each year. So I think that was one of the things we touched on there with the collecting inventory and condition information. You need to make sure that those that are responsible for the assets, those that are maintaining the assets, everybody that goes in and open up that cabinet is able to update things and link together. Otherwise, that first step of collecting information can become very difficult for an agency.
Okay, yeah, and then just my experience through this research and talking to our stakeholders, one of the challenges that I've heard come up quite frequently is the issue of terminology and what is considered an asset. Is it the entire signal intersection? Is it each of the components? I know in some of the slides Gareth went over the level of detail in the asset identification theme in terms of signal asset versus signal component asset, and maybe a hierarchy that we found to be useful. But that conversation came up quite a bit, where I've even seen a couple of times basically derail the bigger picture and get into the weeds in terms of, okay, is our signal timing plan an asset? Is the data that the signals collect, is that an asset in itself? So I think there was a lot of work to be done in terms of saying, okay, establishing the parameters in terms of, okay, what are limits in terms of where do we want to apply asset management to just for signals. So I think once that becomes agreed upon, I think that can go a long way. Another challenge that's come up is perhaps the asset management systems, maybe the compatibility of using what's already out there in the asset management world, and maybe what's being done in pavements and bridges in terms of the management systems and applying to signals. And I know some agencies have found that that's not exactly an apples-to-apples comparison. There's more nuanced details with signals and even ITS that need to be taken into account. So some have even tried to maybe develop their own systems to track and monitor that. So I appreciate the question. Are there any other questions?
I can't see anything else coming up there, Joe.
Yeah.
But if people do have questions once they get the primer, you've got Joe's contact details are there. But we're more than happy to have a chat with you if you've got some questions that come up. It looks like we've got one more there, Joe.
Yeah. And from Tracy again, signal seems like they could provide some complications with management and operations of signals being done by various jurisdictions. Did you find much data sharing across jurisdictions? I'm trying to recall if we've seen examples of that. Have you? Yeah.
I think from what I remember, Joe, I think there was a good example. I want to say it was, I want to say that it was in Los Angeles. I think there was a good example there of where they were sharing information and working together across jurisdictions. So, I think there are some examples there. We can have a look at that, and we can find out where that is happening. But I think that was one I think that came up from the listening sessions, if I remember. I don't know if you've come across other examples, Joe.
I haven't seen too many examples of, and I'm assuming this is more on the local agency level, where neighboring jurisdictions would share data or coordinate. I know a lot of examples that they kind of keep to their own jurisdiction, but I mean, I think if I recall right, like you said, Gareth, I mean, places like LA may be doing that to some extent. Or between states and localities. Okay. I have not heard of that particular level of data sharing in terms of maybe the condition or maintenance aspect of signal systems. Gareth, have you, from the state, between state and local agencies?
I mean, I think there is some coordination from a communications perspective. I've heard of that happening here locally where I am, but I guess one of the things that the asset management plan process does look at from a payments and bridge perspective is that communication with local agencies in terms of what's happening for pavements and bridges on the national highway system. So that's a big requirement that sort of coordination is happening. But from a signals perspective, as I say, I've heard of situations here locally in Michigan where that is happening, but I can't think of any exact examples to share here.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, good question. Any other questions? While people are thinking, I'll use this opportunity to plug in the webinar on Thursday. I see Nilo plugged in the registration in the chat box, but it's similar to what you've seen today, but now we're going to be Thursday. We're going to be focusing on ITS. So same time at 1:30 Eastern.
And a lot of the concepts very similar. Are very similar between signals and ITS. We didn't come across some huge differences there, and so there'll be a lot of similarities between this presentation and that one for the other side of things.
Okay, last call for any questions. Okay, hearing none, definitely appreciate the opportunity just to share what we've researched over the past couple of years. So again, if you have any follow-up questions, just feel free to reach out to me. There's my email address on the slide in front of you. But with that, I can turn over to Nilu. Again, thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Joe. So I really appreciate everyone's time and information shared here. As I said at the beginning, we are posting the PDF of this presentation and the recording on the NOCO website within a few days, so you can check that out. And that's all I had. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.